Let's move on to our second speaker, Nida Rehman, who is an assistant professor of architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. She earned her PhD in cultural geography at the University of Cambridge, a Master of Science in Architecture and Urbanism from MIT, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University.
Two images on my title slide. I couldn't decide. Okay. Quick thanks to everyone, the organizers, for having me. Quick apology to Leo Marx for my working title, which I will change at some point. And so, British lawns are supposed to be owned by just one species, C tells me with amusement and disdain. They're too miserly that way. Tauba. We were sitting on the ground in his living room in Lahore in mid-August. The windows looked over onto a lovely kikar tree in his garden, and our conversation unfolded over a long afternoon spanning topics and timelines, from his maternal grandmother tilling soil in her garden, to Mughal botanical genealogies, to migrant plants and birdsong. I'll come back to all this. For now, I want to stay with the trouble of British lawns. I'm using this, his astute, if slightly cheeky moniker, to not only think about turf grass, but also a broad range of contemporary landscapes in urban Lahore. Gardens in private elite residences whose grassy manicured lushness relies on intensive water use and chemical additives. So-called beautified streetscapes and park spaces managed by the Parks and Horticulture Authority, where brigades of Malis, gardeners, toil in the heat to maintain daylilies, topiaries, and chiaris that have replaced old shade-giving trees. And sprouting real estate ventures whose advertised horticulture paradigms, from the Mughal garden to the tropical paradise, run cover for land and profit grabs. Such landscapes have been the subject of robust critique in critical geography and environmental humanities, particularly in the context of late capitalist urban development. Paul Robbins and his collaborators in their work on the political ecologies of the lawn industrial complex here in the United States have carefully examined how chemical, ideological, and political entanglements shape individual and social identities around the making and maintenance of turf grass. Work by Amita Baviskar and Leila Fernandez and others has called out the exclusionary, and violent class and caste politics that underlie the making of urban parks, ordered green spaces, and beautification schemes in South Asia, such as these. In Pakistan, Danish Mustafa and Franklin Ginn have situated these kinds of greening practices within a wider set of governmental aspirations emerging in the aftermath of General Musharraf's 1999 military coup, when exotic plants and Dubai-esque landscapes acted as what they called, quote, a visual grammar and as horticultural currency towards presenting a soft image of the country. Working with and also beyond these critiques, I want to consider this kind of space, let's stick with the term British lawn, as an agent, archive, and site of changing climates, alongside and intimately connected to the plantation, the forest, the botanical garden, and others. This means looking behind neoliberal logics towards longer histories of manipulating ecologies and climates under colonialism. Here I'm thinking with Al Weisman's articulation of climate change as colonial apparatus. In The Conflict Shoreline, Weisman examines the threshold which marks the change from ostensible desert to settled territory in the Negev in Israel-occupied Palestine. In meteorology, this threshold is naturalized in the form of the 200 millimeter isohyet, or the aridity line, to indicate the minimum annual precipitation required to sustain cultivation without irrigation, or artificial irrigation. Weisman writes that the shoreline of the desert extends from northern Africa and the Middle East through the Negev and across Syria, Afghanistan, and into Pakistan. Across this edge, colonialism creates the conditions for changing the climate, of pushing the desert back, of making it, quote, making it bloom, and thus erasing indigenous life worlds. The climate, he writes, has always been a a project for colonial powers, which they have continuously acted to engineer. We can follow the aridity line into the Indus Valley in British colonial Punjab, where starting in the 1850s, after annexation by the East India Company, the political economy of empire was built on an environmental and technological imaginary of transforming so-called semi-arid desert wastelands of the interfluvial doabs into irrigated and settled territory, specifically agricultural territory. This involved bringing millions of acres of land into new forms of productivity and settlement through the building of perennial canals, forest plantations, and botanical and horticultural exchange networks. It also relied on the reordering of property regimes and social structures through the delimitation, criminalization, and decimation of indigenous pastoral practices. Today, one of the ruinous legacies of this history, which continues into the post-colonial period with further large-scale transformations of Punjab's waterscape and across the Indus, is the increasingly extreme flooding, which has led scholars and activists to make urgent calls for decolonizing water in policy and development sectors. Many lines also connect these regional transformations to urban change. I have examined previously how Lahore's urban development in the mid and late 19th century, particularly the creation of residential, institutional, and public green spaces, was materially and ideologically informed by the colonial project of so-called improvement in Punjab, albeit in ways that were contingent, inconsistent, and subject to the disobedience of material actors and human actors. Thinking about this idea of the universal as always also being contingent. This included the discursive extension of the concept of waste underpinning urban and landscape development, and in a more material sense, the use of the city as site, testing ground, and dissemination hub for the instruments and infrastructures of colonial climate change. Here, canal water was extended to irrigate government facilities and new residential developments. Urban gardens became sites to acclimatize imported species and expand the capacities of soils and plants in efforts towards large-scale planting and commodification. Malis trained along these lines in Lahore were deputed across the province. Exhibitions, plant shows, nurseries, and demonstration gardens ushered an enduring aesthetic culture of modern horticultural and landscape design. Post-colonial and contemporary urban development has continued to rehearse colonial horticultural aesthetics, promoting water-intensive trees, manicured lawns, and ornamental shrubs. Yet, access to nature and open spaces and infrastructures that support livable environments is highly stratified by class, caste, and gender. Destruction of shade-giving trees and rampant urbanization has exacerbated the crisis of atmospheric contamination, making Lahore into one of the most polluted cities in the world. Inconsistent access to water plagues the urban majority, while elite spaces rely on water tanks and generators, along with marginalized labor, to keep lawns lush. Meanwhile, extractive developments at the urban margins decimate social and ecological life worlds. These are the ongoing afterlives of colonial and post-colonial improvement, environmental governance underpinned by logics of exclusion, enclosure, and extraction. So C's critique of the British lawn as a paradigm of anthropocentrism and property relations, when he says owned by just one species, humans, helps me think about how colonial modes of enclosure and severed ecological relations are foundational to the making and maintenance of urban landscapes. What does it mean for a landscape to be miserly, for its aspirations and attachments to be narrow by design? Here, physical and visual entanglements are pruned down in favor of hygienic modernist aesthetics, erasing diverse meanings, uses, and possibilities. Access is limited to those who fulfill certain criteria of race, class, species. And the conscription of plant life towards capitalist value cuts off broader social and ecological pathways. And the vagaries and joys of care and maintenance are surrendered to more regimented and brutal forms of labor or mechanized upkeep. Yet I would argue and hope that situated readings of the garden and garden-making practices also open avenues to consider other types of inhabitations, embodiments, and species relations. So for the rest of the presentation, I want to share a couple of brief vignettes based on ethnographic interviews and visits I conducted in Lahore this summer. I will share insights from two of my interlocutors whose philosophical, poetic, and practical reflections on garden work offer, I think, counter-narratives to the Anthropocene logics of colonial, post-colonial, and neoliberal environmental management. L, pictured here, wears many hats. A trained geologist and researcher, one of the earliest GIS experts in the country, and with professional and lived experience in rural agrarian contexts. These days, he's a tireless member of environmental and climate action groups in Lahore, advocating for ecosystem protection, afforestation, sustainable food production, and waste management, and more fundamentally, I think, a change in kind of the aesthetic and ethical values around urban nature. On a more daily basis, he works with his wife on a small farm garden they have built at their home in a peripheral suburb about 20 kilometers south of the city center. The garden was quiet when I visited in late August. His wife was out of town, and Elle had spent the morning preparing the beds for the upcoming autumn planting season, solitary except for his friendly goats in their neat enclosure. After a few hours of conversation and tea, he was ready to show me around. We started in the compost pits. For him, Lahore's summer heat is a blessing for fast biodegradation. The temperature conditions are so good, he tells me, that all kinds of life forms. It thrives. Composting and soil making is central to Elle's practice. He tells me, you have to be a soil farmer before anything else. Drawing both on his geological expertise and lived knowledge of soil conditions, he explains that the hard, heavy clay of Punjab has poor permeability and aeration. He pulls his hands over his heads to demonstrate, saying that working the soil, opening it up for cultivation with the kai or kassi, which are the Punjabi and Urdu terms for locally produced iron hoe, is very torturous work, limited to the most able-bodied. At the same time, the more tedious labor of godi, which is to use a trowel or ramba, to break up soil is often done by women or children, as it requires getting into the narrow spaces and planted field rows. Instead, making the compost or making the soil, besides providing nutrient-rich biomass, opens possibilities for other forms of labor and socio-ecological relations. He tells me that he and his wife, both elderly, work comfortably with the soil they make in situ over the raised beds that he has designed and built, so they don't have to keep bending down and up. It is one way he hopes to entice others. So more than a personal practice, the farm garden represents a place to experiment with remaking the city as a place that can produce its own food. Hosting small group workshops and trainings, Elle freely shares his knowledge and experience to entice interest in organic farming and composting. He draws inspiration from near and far, talking enthusiastically, for instance, about Havana's urban agriculture, a result of the food crisis following the fall of the Soviet Union and the US trade embargo in Cuba, and about Lahore's own pre-colonial tradition of Arai market gardeners around the area of Bagbanpura, who grew and supplied vegetables to the city. He advocates for unused publicly held land in the city to be given over for common farming uses, a vision situated in a critique of the city's rapacious development over and contamination of its agrarian hinterlands. At the same time, his work emerges from a deep understanding of the regional geographies of modernizing land and landscape. Weaving geological, meteorological, and hydrological knowledge, he explains that prior to their re-engineering, rivers and nalas braided across the Punjab without boundaries, while the Indus appeared as a, quote, green line through the desert. Now, he says, we have been, quote, encroaching on the desert, changing climate. Echoing Weissman, albeit without the explicit political critique, he says, quote, we are changing the climate, changing the pattern of the monsoon. We shouldn't change it any further. Like Elle, reflections on the materiality of the earth, bodily engagements, and working with tools are central to C's garden practice. He tells me that his love for gardening started in childhood. Quote, "Bachpan se shauk tha baghbani ka," that I was interested since, or I enjoyed gardening since I was a child. Watching his maternal grandmother as she escaped to her courtyard during family gatherings when they got contentious. With animated gestures, he tells me, almost as a defense mechanism, she would hunch down in the planted beds and start working, breaking up the soil, godi karna. And that he would be fascinated with the act of waking up dead soil by the act of puncturing it with a sharp tool. As an artist, a poet, and a scholar, C likens the act of manipulating the mitti, the earth, to make a seed bed to drawing in the earth. It is a powerful act, he says. It anchored me. Over the past few years, he has worked to transform his own garden from what he calls an empty British lawn into a forest. Staying within his faith, C's devotion to Allah and Islam is pretty clear. He tells me that he deeply resists the supposed superiority, what he calls the ashraful makhlukatness of our species, like the superiority of our species. It is colonialism, he remarks, and most of all capitalism, that decided that, quote, "we are the most superior among all species, that the river and the mountains and the glaciers and the seas are all inferior to us, that we can control them all." And it was capital's, quote, "standardization of time on the planet that allowed for the hubris, superiority, and mastery to be enacted." Quote, "how to be dominant over the entire creation, kaise havi hona hai." Our planetary emergency, he laments, is the curse, the curse of everyone non-human that we have harmed in the process. Acknowledging the impossibility of mastery and deeply resistant to ill-considered interventions, C thus looks to the bashinde, the residents of his garden, as he slowly builds his own knowledge and practice of Baghbani. In conversation, he refers to these residents in anthropocentric but loving terms, to animals and plants as hamnawa, compatriots, collaborators. Referring to non-human trees as muhajirin, immigrants or migrants, he refers to their resilience. Hijrat karne wali soul, the soul who migrates, the one who migrates, is bestowed with such adaptive and unrelenting power, that will to survive, he says, that it shakes, quote, established norms and realities to the core. Those are his words. Resisting their vilification in environmental discourse, he observes how, for instance, a Conocarpus tree becomes a fortress, or became a fortress, for a family of crows in his garden, the flexibility of its trunk allowing the new home to withstand a strong storm. With care and attentiveness, he observes who comes and who goes from the garden. Until now, every year, bees had been entrusting me and entrusting the neem tree outside our house. But this year, he says, they've finally made a home in the armpit of the amaltas tree. He proudly shows me the swelling hive when we go outside. So I could go on with the stories. I haven't really started thinking about them too much yet. There's a lot more for me to transcribe and write and think about. So I'll leave them here. These gifts my interlocutors gave me. I will also try to avoid wrapping up with any kind of neat conclusions. I'm not there yet. As I work on my book, from which this somewhat disjointed presentation comes, I'm continuing to think with different kinds of knowledge-making, embodied practices, and the poetics of urban nature, such as that of L and C's work. I see them as openings to pursue different ethics, aesthetics, and politics of landscape, beyond the violent disclosures, enclosures, and erasures of changing climates. And then I'll leave you with a final photograph of the garden of my late friend and mentor, the feminist artist and activist Lala Rukh, which she tended with love, and from where she would take seeds from her neem tree to surreptitiously and joyfully sow in Lahore's urban spaces.